So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the first panel this morning, Robert Sutton, who is Professor of Management Science and Engineering in the Stanford Engineering School, and also, by a courtesy appointment, Professor of Organizational Behavior in the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He's the co-director of the Center for Work, Technology, and Organization. He's an active researcher and an author. He's written a number of books, the latest one of which is one of my favorite business-related books of all time, with the provocative title, The No Asshole Rule, Building a Civilized Workplace and Surviving One That Isn't. He is very actively involved as a co-founder and member of something at Stanford called the D School, which is an interdisciplinary approach to design and business and design thinking. And we know Bob is going to do a great job, so I'm going to turn it over to him now. And the panel, please welcome Bob Sutton in our panel this morning.
So what we're going to do this morning is to have a conversation about cultures of innovation and what was learned from the PLATO experience and what happened at CERL, the lab. They told me to call it the lab because I would mess it up. And what we'll do is essentially we'll talk for about 60 minutes or so, 65 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from you folks. Let me start out with brief introductions. I'm sort of brought in, I feel like I'm from another planet in this process because the PLATO and CERL experience, it really was like this apparently cult-like world, so I may mess up some of this. The first person is somebody I heard a lot about, I want to introduce. I'm actually going to start with David, so raise your hand. David Frankel. So I was especially briefed by Brian Deere. Apparently David Frankel started working there when you were like 7 years old, was that correct?
It's a little bit of an exaggeration.
And
I learned that from Don.
So David grew up in Champaign-Urbana and went to University High and did a lot of work at the lab as a teenager, and also worked at Control Data, which Bob Price ran for quite a few years, and now is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. So I guess the next person I should introduce then is Bob Price. So Bob Price, as I said, is the former chairman and CEO of Control Data, which was, for those of us and most of you in the audience know, an enormously influential company, which was also involved in the PLATO implementation as well. He also continues to be busy teaching management and the like at the Fuqua Business School, which is at Duke University, and he's author of a book called The Eye for Innovation. Then, sitting right next to me is C.K. Tina Gunsalus. No.
Close. Gunsalus.
Gunsalus, who I've actually is one of my email friends, and I just met her today. So, but I don't know how to pronounce her name. So Tina also grew up in Champaign-Urbana and started working at the lab when she was 16 years old. So she also was there very early and was there for 10 years. Somewhere along the line, she became a lawyer and also wrote a book, which isn't even mentioned here. But my favorite sentence that she wrote me was, ever since she was at CERL, she never had a position that existed before she had it. So that's in Don Bitzer's spirit, that what she did was, it didn't matter what the existing organizational structure was, she found what they actually call an idiosyncratic job to use her talents, which is quite good. And Don Bitzer, who especially to this group doesn't require much introduction, is of course the father of PLATO and the inventor of the plasma screens, which you see around you. And then I also found out he won an Emmy Award, which I thought was quite fascinating. Okay, I think that's more than enough introduction. Why don't we start out and to learn a little bit more, and mostly I'm going to ask Don questions last because, as I think people in the audience know better than me, Don played such a huge role. I think we should talk about him and then have him kind of defend himself. Maybe that's sort of like a good sort of model. So Tina, why don't we start with you, and maybe you could take a couple minutes and describe your role in the lab and sort of like what you did there.
Oh, I was a bit player in the lab. I started in the PLATO Services Organization as a user consultant. When I got my job at the lab, I actually went to see Don when I was in high school, a senior in high school, and said, I don't know anything about computers and I don't know anything about PLATO, but I'm really interested and I'd like to work here. And Don gave me a job. And not only did he give me a job, he said, how much do you think you ought to make? And I said, oh, I don't know, $2 an hour. And Don said, I'm going to pay you $2.25. And for that 25 cents an hour, I would have gone out and laid down in the road in front of the lab if Don had said that was my job. I thought, oh, $2.25, he thinks I'm worth something. So I worked for the PLATO Services Organization. I did some stuff for Don. I worked for the system software staff. I discovered along the way in this lab full of very talented people that I was an adequate at best, fair programmer, and really a pretty good organizer. So I organized.
All right, that's great. Well, maybe I'll ask David next. So David, what role do you play at the lab? I've heard all these stories about you behind your back, but maybe you could describe them as you understand them.
Many of those are false, and actually I think part of what's interesting is that really I was not that unique there. I was young. There were other people that started there very young. I came to CERL when I was 12. I was going to high school or junior high just a half a block away, and had done a little bit of study with the rudimentary electronic systems that were available there, and then was aware that there was something in this other building. And at that time, well, in fact, on the front door of that building there was no lock. So 24 hours a day, you could go into that building, and as a kid, I just wandered in, and there were 4 floors, 4.5, and sort of go through each one, and there's chalkboards on the hallway walls, and you sort of look around and you try to get a sense of what's going on. I knew that there was a lot happening there. People would occasionally ask me if they could help me or if I wanted something, and sometimes I'd ask a question. Sometimes I'd pick up printouts that had been discarded in the recycling box and just read them to try to learn what was going on. And eventually got myself halfway educated about how this fantastic system worked, again, through the help of all these people who amazingly just answered my questions when I asked, can you explain this to me? Or how would I do this if I wanted to? And you could, at that time, on the second floor of the building, what was sort of the operation, at that time PLATO 3 was running. This was in about 1972. But on the 4th floor was where the new PLATO 4 was being developed, and it wasn't yet really operational. And so it was in a prototype mode, and there was all this gear sitting there, and I acted like I belonged. And after a year or so, I did. And I came to ask for a job as well. Seemed like the capitalist thing to do. My father was an economics professor at the university, and to my chagrin found out that you can't be paid, or at that time you couldn't be paid in Illinois as an employee if you were under 14. So I worked. I worked for food. I worked for. I got a ski jacket. I got a typewriter. And the day I turned 14, I went around with my little form, my underage employment form, and I had that signed in advance by my mom, and I got it signed by my high school principal, and I got it signed by Don, and then I was employed for, I hate to burst your bubble, Tina, but I got $2.31 an hour.
Well, you were always more valuable than I was.
All right, Bob. Bob had a little different kind of involvement.
My perspective is not from the inside, like Tina and Dave. By the time we first had contact with the University of Illinois, I was the general sales manager of control data, which may not seem too remarkable, except that you have to remember I came out of the lab at Livermore as a mathematician and grew up as a mathematician programmer, and somehow or other became general sales manager for control data. So it was different. But we had a salesman at the time by the name of Harold Brook, and he was really a remarkable guy. Harold had never even seen a computer. He didn't even know how to spell it when he came to work for control data. He worked for American Hoist and Derrick, and he sold huge derricks, and that was his role in life. But Harold had two characteristics. One, he had an insatiable curiosity about new things. And secondly, he loved people. And Harold got to know, we had sold the University of Illinois in 1604, and Harold got to know Don, and he was appalled at he came to me and said, Bob, you can't believe that kludge that they have this thing hooked up to. We've got to get them a real computer. And so we went to see Bill Norris, and Harold was very good on both ends of the sale. So Don and the university got a 1604, the most powerful computer around, for the insurance and air conditioning, which I think was a total of $145 a year. And so the beginning of the cooperation with Don and the university started with that. And then by the time we got into a formal relationship on PLATO with NSF and with the university and control data, and that would have been, what, Don, 73, 74? Anyway, I was executive vice president for services, and education was a part of my responsibility in control data. So from that point on, it was just one thing after another, and we kind of grew up together.
Great. So Don, you want to defend yourself? Like, what, in terms of describing your role?
First of all, you only hear partial truths. For example, when I employed David, we could only employ him at age 14 under the Farm Labor Act in Illinois. So they let kids out of school to go help get the crops done. So that's how we employed him, but he didn't tell you the whole story of what we paid him. Under the law, we had to give him 2 extra breaks each day and food twice a day. Now, he did stop to take the breaks, and he didn't eat much, but he had that opportunity under the law in order for us to hire him. I think that as you look at what people did, there were numerous young people who came in, and there were several aspects about them. One is they didn't know the word "we can't." And I didn't know the words "we won't." So if they ever came to me and said, we'd like to build some kind of system which will allow us to do word looks up and so forth like they do in Google, I said, fine, go to it, do whatever you want to do. And after a while, they would come back and almost always presented a resultant plan which you wouldn't believe how well it was thought through. So even though they were very young, even though we paid them rather poorly, they were very mature in their job respect. And so I didn't have to do much management at all. In fact, the less I did, the better it was, because then I didn't bother them and detract from the good work that they were doing. And that's what I think is the main story, is what we did for people who continued to go out that way and live in life, start up new things, work in that way.
I just have to say something, because something Don said just struck me. It hadn't really occurred to me in 35 years, but you know, I get on the phone, I get so frustrated with these service providers, an airline or a phone company or whatever it is. There'll be something broken or something that needs to be done, and they'll say to me, we can't do that for you.
Our computer doesn't do that.
Well, they say specifically, I can't do that. And I say to them, no, you won't do that. And she says, well, we can't. I say, yes, you can. It's possible to do this. It's that you won't do it. And that distinction, and Don made that distinction in what he just said. I don't know if you caught it, but that was just so powerful. You know, when I was there, from the time I was 12 to 20, and as he said, we never had the attitude that it can't be done. Somehow we'll come up with some crazy kludge to get it done. People just didn't know any better. That's part of the reason that young people were attracted there.
Well, I think we're already into my next question, but I think I'm going to start with Bob to expand on this, because the next question I was going to ask was, if you look at the list of the things that were invented at the lab, it's the plasma TV, the slide projector I found out, which I thought was quite interesting, the help key, the touch panel, and the tutor language for starters. So, and I sort of have 2 questions, and the can't and won't gets at that pretty well. And so I'm going to start with Bob, because he has the outside perspective, which is what was it, in addition, I guess, to the can't and won't, and the fact that apparently child labor was an important part of your success. What was it about the lab that enabled them to do so much rapid innovation? And since you ran a big company, what could other companies learn from what the lab did?
Well, you can't really classify innovators, and I go to some extent to describe different kinds of people who had innovative characteristics in the book, The Eye for Innovation, and people that I've known. But there's one thing that underpins all of that, And you just think about what was said both last night and just now by Tina and David, the attraction of CERL to very young people. Now, what's the characteristic of a child? Curiosity and caring. So if you want to find people who like to innovate, then look for caring curiosity. And you will find a very latent, innovative talent buried within that. And if you can nurture that, which is that's not the way business is set up, but if you can nurture, as Don did, that caring curiosity in young people, and even more if you can do it by the time they're ancient, 30 or so, then you find this culture of innovation becomes captivating for everybody in the organization.
And one thing that David said was sort of interesting was that everybody answered your questions. And there's a lot of places I've been where you don't ask in the first place, when you do, they don't answer them. And that's a very valuable thing, I think. So Tina, what's your take on this? So what was it about the lab that enabled them and you to innovate, and what can other companies learn from it, other places, even academic institutions?
I think the two really critical things about the lab, and you know, if you think about what I said, I was such a bit player in terms of the technology. What I represent really is the people that Don grew and the spirit that he had. And I think that for me, the two things about the lab were that it was so mission focused, and Don was so focused on the mission, and the freedom. And the things that led to were, one, the place was a dump. I mean, Don, it was so mission focused that there was no money spent on anything that wasn't going to advance the mission. And even if it was going to advance a mission, there had to be a cheaper way to do it. Don is, I believe the polite word is frugal. I had an aunt who used to say, "My arms are short and my pockets are deep." And every time Don would talk about something, I would think, oh yeah, I know how this works. So the mission was everything. It wasn't about personal aggrandizement. It wasn't about, you know, and there was the politics that you always get when people are around, but it was really about the mission and the sense that gave everybody that we were doing something that mattered. We were going to make the world a better place. And for whatever reason and whatever we were doing there, whatever the selfish impulse was, there was that belief in the air that we were doing something that really was a good thing. And then the freedom was unbelievable. And the freedom taught a lot of different lessons because for most of the people, most of the time, there was almost no oversight. There was almost no check and balance or accountability or anything. So you pretty early came to the crossroads where either you developed an integrity about what you did and why you were there and reporting your hours and things, or you didn't. And those people, by and large, tended to drift away.
So did you get rid of them, or did, like, what happened with the people?
I don't think Don ever got rid of anybody.
System.
No.
But so how come the people who didn't have integrity or weren't constructive, how come they drifted out? Because something socially must have been going on.
Because the atmosphere, and David, maybe you want to talk about this, the atmosphere was such that what mattered was the contribution and the problem solving and having fun solving the problems. And if you weren't having fun and if you weren't engaged and weren't making a contribution, you didn't matter.
Okay, so this is there's a company I worked with for years called IDEO, which only recently actually started using real performance evaluations in the system that very successful, innovative firm that David Kelly, who's the founder and also a Stanford professor, would use is, well, if nobody talks to you, you know it's time to leave. And and it's a pretty effective model because ostracism is better than laying people off in some time.
Well, I don't think anybody, have you ever in your whole career asked anybody to go?
Well, there were a few times when we didn't ask them. If we had an operator whose job was to monitor the system, make control parameters, they had keys to the kingdom. And if they ever misused those keys to the kingdom, they had to go. And our system kept track of every possible thing. And it would print me out a sheet. And if I got a sheet out that said the operator last night violated the rules, I walked downstairs, go to his office. He'd be cleaning out his desk as he saw me come in. He put it down. He left. He knew he had done things wrong. So there were those kind of things. Otherwise, we were always focused on working on things which are important for people. We wanted to make sure that we were helping benefit mankind. And if you're playing around and you know you're not contributing to that, maybe even getting in the way, you naturally just want to get somewhere where you'll fit in better.
Doesn't feel good.
The problem solving, I mean, I've been thinking about this intently as I reflected on the time there. My job, I was a programmer, and I worked on this developing, emerging PLATO 4 system. And it wasn't obvious to me at the time, but everything was around solving problems. And you took a problem off the stack. I mean, there was a virtual stack of problems, of issues, of challenges that needed to be solved. And that's what you focused on, and that's what drove the organization. There came up some wacky solutions that were just inane, but you had to solve the problem. And you know, you could defer a problem and move on to another problem, but that's what you had to do. And I remember, as a student there, I had to get my time card signed every 2 weeks to get paid. And so I would fill the thing out with the hours I'd worked, and I'd have to find somebody on the staff to vouch for that. And it wasn't just a matter of, okay, were you really here on Thursday for 3.5 hours? It was, okay, this is fine, I'm sure the hours are legit, but what problem did you solve? And so that was a self-selection mechanism that if you weren't somehow contributing to this greater cause, which was, you know, computer-based education and figuring out how to do this or how to do that, and you know, senior people broke that down into smaller problems, so people like myself got, you know, some chunk that I then had to go and do over the course of hours or days or weeks.
I think what David is saying is just so key to this whole culture of innovation, to being innovative, because it is problem solved. But it's not just academic or theoretical problem solved. There's a mission there, and everything has a purpose, and that's the difference between innovation and invention and creativity. There's a purpose out there that you're driving towards. And it's not huge breakthroughs. There's lots of little breakthroughs because people become innovative by solving problems, and they do it through only one way: practice, practice, practice. That's the way you become an innovator, just by doing new problem-solving things over and over again. And that's what kids like David learned very early. And you never lose that. You never lose it once it's instilled.
There was one more element here, which was it was just plain old fun. And a lot of that emanated from Don, because Don's idea of a really good time, he would come back and he would say, oh, in the airplane, I was doing math problems. And Don was having a really good time. Don was having fun, and he enjoyed solving problems, and it was contagious, and we were having fun. I mean, the problems were fun, and the problem solving was fun, and the environment was, it was, you know, we worked hard, those who stayed, more or less. I mean, you know, and some harder than others. This was not a, let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. It was a place infested by human beings. But it was fun, by and large.
We got together usually once a week as a group, but we didn't like boring meetings, so we had a party every Friday, and we celebrated somebody's birthday. When you had as many people as we had, it was always somebody's birthday to celebrate. And everybody make cakes, bring them in, and we all get together, and it was a way of exchanging ideas and saying, everybody knew who everybody else and what they were doing. You felt like you were part of the group.
So David, you touched on this, but let me ask you this question first, and other folks can jump in. One of the other things that really struck me, both from talking to you folks and lots of folks talked to me to get ready for this panel, and the reading I did, was that there actually were an incredible number of constraints and obstacles that you had to deal with. It sounds like Tina's laughing. And so technological, political, financial, social. So when you look back, what were, all right, something's happening. When you look
it's an
back,
important point.
When you look back, what were some of the examples or some of the constraints you overcame? And then I would also kind of get to the point of what can other innovators learn from that? Because There's always constraints, but I'm very impressed with the amount of progress that was made given the obstacles and constraints that you folks faced.
Well, I guess I don't know that I was acutely aware at the time that we operated under such terrible constraints. Ray Ozzie mentioned last night, I think, looking back, you see these ridiculous constraints. So just technologically, and the point was made that the cost of memory at the time was outrageous. So there were all sorts of things that were precious resources that just had to be used extremely sparingly. So from a technical standpoint, in the work that I did, not that this was, again, rocket science, but it just was a fact. We had this processor that ran at some number of single-digit, 20 megahertz, whatever it was. By today's standards, it was extremely slow. We had a whopping 65 kilowords of memory in the 6400, so you had to be very sparing in how you use these things, and that was just a fact of life. The resources in the lab, we had a fourth-floor hardware lab where we had things to construct stuff. But if I wanted to make a trip over to the Double E stores, half a block away, to buy something new, that was a challenge. It was just innately, it was money, but it was also a hassle. And if you could construct something, if you could fish something out of the garbage can and do it with that would be faster and quicker and just easier. So
and much more suited to the sort of ethos of the place.
Yeah.
My first desk was bolted together and had a 2x4 that held up the corner because it was perfectly functional.
That was, we didn't really have a need for a lot of show. That clearly was not, in terms of problem solving, it was just to get the job done.
So since you're a technological entrepreneur and have been doing this for quite a while, so what's been the effect on your career in terms of operating under such constraints, and what would you advise other people?
I'll tell you, sometimes I get mad in this valley because although it runs in cycles, sometimes the dollar spigot gets turned on full force, and the waste is just disgusting to me, and the sort of things that it breeds in people's operating mentality is so sad. But still, you have fun with it when the money's flowing freely. So, but then when the pendulum swings the other way, again, my attitude with teams that I work with is, let's just keep looking. You want to say no or can't, and I'm not going to accept that answer. Let's keep looking, or let's set it aside for a moment. Let's revisit it. Come back and talk to me when you have something that you can do, and that's how we evolve things.
Yeah, I think they mentioned, or maybe it was Tina, that I think Tina mentioned Don's frugality, and the same thing was true of Bill Norris, by the way. Very, very frugal people, penny pinching. But underneath or along with that, there's a very important thing, and this Tina did mention, and that is there are always resource constraints. It doesn't make any difference what you're doing, there are resource constraints. So the thing that gets you through all that is to have fun. And if you can't have fun at what you're doing, you aren't going to do it. You aren't going to solve anything or accomplish anything, because you become preoccupied with the constraints as opposed to the fun of making something instead of going across the street.
Well, there are other things that people get preoccupied with. They get preoccupied with furniture and buildings, yes, and trappings and things like that. And that was just a non-starter. They just, truly the place.
So this reminds me. So one of, and many of you will know, probably the I don't know the most famous, but maybe the most successful venture capitalist in Silicon Valley history is Arthur Rock, who was the primary venture capitalist behind Apple and Intel, so two major companies that are doing pretty well. And Arthur Rock was incredibly cheap, by the way. I went to a baseball game with him once, and he owns part of the San Francisco Giants, but he brought sandwiches because the prices were too expensive. I'm not joking. And so when he screens entrepreneurs, there's two things for him that are a non-starter. One is when their nails are too nicely done. To him, that means they're not thinking about the right thing. And then he looks at their car, and if their car is too nice, and he likes an old dirty car is perfect. because to him that's a sign that he's like focused, like, and it isn't the money. It's like they're focused on the sort of like the right thing. So Don, you've been kind of quiet here. So like, what's your sort of take on this constraint stuff?
But I will second what they said about me being the automobile I drove was an old Volkswagen, very well torn up. And my office set the standards for everybody else. It was out in the tar. And it was...
you had that really cheap plastic paneling in it, though, that would...
cheap, it was everything, even got a rug on it one time, it's part of it. But generally speaking, I didn't have time to worry about things like that. Sometimes my secretaries would get upset that it was getting so shabby and they'd do something. But generally speaking, that was not what was important. I saw a picture of the third floor hallway yesterday. I wasn't sure which floor it was.
It took us a long time to figure out what hallway it was.
Because they all looked the same. But I can remember the only time we really got anything remodeled there was when the governor came to visit us. The state suddenly decided, they came over and looked at the building, and they decided, we have to remodel the rooms he's going to be in, so he doesn't know how bad things are here. And so we managed to get one room, I think, or one or two rooms remodeled with the governor's visit.
This business of having fun, I mean, that's the other element, and fun was, you had these constraints. So in today's modern world, of course, if you were running a system like this, you'd have multiple mainframe computers so that you could have a production system and a test, and we didn't have that luxury. So somebody mentioned yesterday we had prime time that ended at 10 o'clock, and then we could do our work from 10 until 6 in the morning when there was daily maintenance on the machine until 7:30 when production started again. And so for me, what that meant as a 13-year-old is I would take the bus, the last city bus of the day in the evening to work, and then work through the night and take the first bus home in the morning. And
This is when you were still in high school? You go to high school?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the summertime, I didn't have to go to high school. So in the summertime, I more worked the evening hours with parental permission. And, part of the fun was that I would go in the evening and I would get to have dinner we'd go to Campus Town, we'd go out and we'd get pizza, and some number of the people in the group, and usually these people were older and smarter than me, and I'd get to go and tap their brains, and then we'd come back, and at 10 o'clock, we'd start working. And it was fun. So we turned the constraints into, instead of grousing about, oh, geez, I got to work, third shift tonight, it was great.
The idea lists the things to work on, extended from the company, CDC, down to us and back the other way. I remember one time at about 11 o'clock, I used to run at noon. In fact, the young people used to run with me. I go get my car and pick them up on the way back. They didn't get that far. I wanted them to get out and work out. So I would go out and run every noon, 15, 20 miles. And so I was about ready to leave at 11 o'clock, and Jack Stifel, who was my chief of digital engineering upstairs, came downstairs. He said, I just got a call from CDC. And he said, they're trying to put our signals on a cable. And they find out that after about 30 or 40 terminals, there's so many collisions, they can't put any more on, and they don't know what to do. And so I said, well, I'm going to run. I'll think about it on the run. So I went out running, and to show you how things come to you quickly, you started thinking about it for a while, and you realize that collision rates go up with the number of users. But the probability of getting through a signal goes up exponentially. So if you just send more, cause more collisions, but make sure the redundant data, the likelihood of getting through is much higher. And I remember going back and telling Jack, call them back and tell them to send, if they're having collision problems, tell them to send more. But make it redundant. And then that led to our cable modem development. Huh. So there was a lot of back and forth. The ideas didn't matter where we did them.
Bob, were you going to add something?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, so the next question I want to ask is I wasn't there last night, but I have a sense of that this occasion is in part a celebration of the PLATO and CERL, if I'm getting that right, experience. But the fact remains that in everything in life, that not everything goes perfectly, and at least from what I understand, not everything went perfectly in this case, and it never does. And one of my favorite expressions along this regard, it's from Eleanor Roosevelt, is that essentially we should learn from the mistakes of others, in part because none of us can live long enough to make every mistake ourselves. So sort of in that spirit, looking back, what were some of the things that might have been done differently, and what advice would you give to other folks maybe to avoid some of the mistakes you made? And Don, I'll get you last, but let me start with Tina on this one.
I'm going to pass on this one to see what the others have to say.
Oh, all right, so they're ducking.
Well, mine aren't technological issues. Mine are the
okay. Well, let's go to
issues.
David
So
and then Bob. Then, since
Well, so I'm just not a big believer in do-over. I think that I have no, I guess, regrets. What I certainly did learn there was to embrace failure. So I love failing. And
so that's it. But that's good. That's
but we again, the lab environment, you really didn't get in trouble. I think Ray last night mentioned doing something as non-prime time started and crashing the system. And that's a fact of life when you're working on a complex system like that. These things happen. And it's not right. You know that's a mistake. But you didn't get fired for doing that. When the system crashed, we all raced to the computer room, and the race then was to who could figure out first what had caused that and how we were going to fix it. And you didn't beat somebody up and start accusing people and so on. The first order of business was, let's understand, diagnose the problem, let's get it repaired and get the system going again, and let's do what we can to prevent it from happening again. And if that's teaching somebody something, making something aware of that,
what did you learn from this?
But we never beat people up for failing, and that's something I certainly took away from my experience there. And so now, when people come to me and they tell me, David, I've got terrible news. We just found a bug in such and such, this software or hardware design that we've released. And I'd say, that's great. So, well, what do you mean that's great? It's terrible. We're going to have to redo all this stuff. I know, but you found the bug. That's what's so good. Now we can go back and address it. It was there. And so I think that aspect of failure is just so important, and organizationally you have to figure out, because in doing complex things you're going to fail at times. So how do you recover?
Bob, I'll get to you next, but I think this is an important point, because it sounds like it actually happened in the lab as opposed to there was rhetoric around it.
Routinely. I mean, there were all sorts of, I wanted to be there so I could be there when a disaster happened, because that's when there was so much brain power that would go to work to deal with the problem. I mean, when we had 1,000 users connected to this thing, you hear stories today, Twitter goes down, everybody goes haywire.
Right.
I mean, we had a microcosm of that there. We took it very, very seriously.
So I think that this is an interesting lesson, even though I'm like goading you for things that really did go wrong. I had my students at one point study a bunch of Silicon Valley companies that actually had this rhetoric about how it was safe to fail. And once they got in there, they basically find out that it was all finger pointing and firing people and stigmatizing them. And so a lot of times in Silicon Valley, I think the rhetoric is that we act this way in Silicon Valley, but really we don't.
Well, I'll tell you a story, if I can, from Control Data. When I went there, I worked at Control Data in 77 and in 79. And then actually worked there full-time, worked as a student first and then full-time after that for a number of years. But one of the things that flabbergasted me is I was allowed as a youngster, or a young person, young engineer, into a quarterly, I guess, review meeting. And I was to remain silent in the back, but I got to watch. And these division heads were going through all this, the operating results. And what I realized was that you could get up and you could talk about how you'd gotten your job done and what you'd accomplished. Or you could get up and present a really good reason why you hadn't. And in some cases, you could actually get more credit for the latter. And as I watched and observed again, in one case, I remember specifically, the senior executive, the senior vice president, he was so gleeful that the reason that his group had failed was because of the failure of another division. And an IDWO, an interdivisional work order. We had an IDWO with another division, and they had not fulfilled. And so this guy was so happy that when he went to his staff meeting with his boss, he was going to get to beat the crap out of the other guy and make him look terrible. And that was great.
I think it's probably time for Bob to jump in here.
We didn't have that at CERL.
So, I mean, maybe you could like address this issue a little bit.
Well, the thing that David is talking about, the thing that underpins all this is, and it's common terminology or common knowledge to say we learn from failure, and we learn. But the most common characteristic of an innovative process is failure. And if you let it get to you and beat you up, and if you're going to concentrate on beating other people up because of their failure, then the innovation is going to cease. And I refer to that as an intrinsic motivator for an innovator is lack of fear of failure. In other words, they don't mind having something go wrong because it's fun to fix it. And it's always going to go wrong. So I think that's the key element. And as organizations grow and they get to be big, we tend to lose that sort of thing, which is why, and we didn't succeed at this always, but it's why in control data we tried to keep the operating units relatively small so that you could foster this sense of accomplishment and not just be beating up on one another because of failures.
So Don, what's your take on this? Like,
well, maybe you want me to say what I'm going to say
Oh, no,
first, because
go,
you might not like what I'm going to say.
That's all right. I'll let you go.
From my perspective, if you look at the people aspect of it, you know, the flip side of people's strengths are always their weaknesses. And if you look at what happened to the lab in the university, which was a real failure of an otherwise pretty great institution, the failure of the lab wasn't ever technological. And the system worked, and it did great things, and it changed people's lives, and it still runs today. Don didn't manage up very well, and we didn't do a very good job of marketing what the successes were. And so when the troubles came at the end, there was the university didn't have a full or rich or really deep understanding, or really any understanding at all, of what a gym, the lab was, what the system was, what it meant. The focus was so mission-oriented on serving the users and doing the education that there wasn't a good story or a theme that anybody in the university understood, and understood that they needed to protect and needed to defend and needed to, and that's a pretty big failure in the end of the day.
I'm going to ask Don to respond to this, but I just want to talk about this point in terms of innovation. One of the most interesting, I had a doctoral student who got obsessed with Thomas Edison and like went and read all the papers and everything. And when you look at Thomas Edison, it actually turns out he was a pretty lousy inventor. Like the people who worked for him would joke about how technologically incompetent he was. But he could kind of do two things. He could raise money, and he was good at PR, and also he was okay at organizing the lab, but he was a lousy inventor. So to that point, and there is an argument that runs through much of the innovation literature that one of the characteristics of great innovators is that there's somebody involved who can sell. So that's Steve Jobs meets Steve Wozniak, and boom, you're set.
Well, Don could sell, he just isn't cynical enough. And
he wasn't cynical enough?
He wasn't cynical enough. He isn't cynical enough. He never appropriately underestimated the university administrators.
I'm more cynical than you think. Let me tell you about the university.
Oh, good. Don, I think it's time for you to get in here since everybody's talking about it.
The university, in fact, we did succeed in. We had a foreign language laboratory. The government ended up, we had to get them funded for their internal stuff because the governor liked what we were doing. We had several other large departments with hundreds of physics departments.
Sir, the users great.
The users were great. And the university was supposed to be paying us for use because the government used our system and paid, and they had a contract that they didn't have to pay anything more than the lowest payer. And so the university agreed to pay that rate of the government. They never paid a penny. What they did, and they still play this way, what they did is they transferred money on paper, but we never saw it. And when we finally closed up, we had to earn all of our own money by royalties or services to other people outside the university. So the university was not friendly that way, mostly because they didn't think we needed it. We always got the big contracts in those days. And so they thought that, you know, we should be paying them, not them paying us. So that set a barrier between us and some of the administration, just somewhat. Secondly, there was a lot of competition of people and ideas. And some people whose ideas were not successful at getting contracts and large projects had more time to write things and administrators than we who were working hard. And they're
not cynical enough.
And so we just didn't have time to do that. And one of these things about innovation is that when people failed in our laboratory, I used to get suggestions from some people. I had, 10 or 12 system programmers. If you got 12 system programmers in a group, you got a group that doesn't agree very often. And so one of them would always be in my office suggesting that one of the others be fired. And of course, I never did it, but I knew better because I have quite a few inventions, and I spent a lot of time failing in these inventions. And I know that failure is the road to success. And so when someone came in and said he messed up the day, we ought to get rid of him, I knew that that was a bad attitude, so let's get back and figure out what you can do to help solve the problem. And so they knew that when they came to me that they were talking to someone who understood this kind of problem. And we were small enough that we could get away with that.
We're touching on something here that I think is really critical, a critical part of the innovative entrepreneurial process. And I'm going to digress for just a second, but I'm going to come back to it. But just let me say to start this that you find that people who are, or organizations that are very mission-oriented, and the good part of this is it's the mission orientation that drives the thing and allows it to succeed at all, okay? The flip side of that is that those people are, those organizations are frequently not very good at selling themselves. All too often, they are not, at least in my experience. And there was just a wonderful movie many years ago, and it was Kevin Costner, I think, Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. And the fatal flaw of the innovator is to believe if I build it, they will come. If I succeed, if I solve the problem, if I meet the challenge, then everybody will recognize that instantly. And of course, they don't. So the real difference between innovation, solving, meeting challenges, and entrepreneurship is creating that awareness out there, that demand that causes the thing to have broad acceptance. So marketplace, if you use an economic term, marketplace acceptance is the thing that is really the toughest part of innovation.
So to this point, this isn't just companies. I learned a little bit about this from a friend of mine. I didn't realize that most people who win Nobel Prizes actually spend many years campaigning for it. It isn't just like magically your colleagues, I was explaining to
recognize your work.
Recognize your work. It's like they do the work and then they campaign for it. So even in something that seems pure, it's like there's the sales element of it. So I don't know if it's good or bad, but I guess that's the way that life works.
And the mission-oriented focus meant that the sales were for the users and serving and, and getting it set up in FLB and getting it set up in South Africa and getting it set up at the system at Florida State and serving the users. And I think the overestimation was of the I still work for these people, so I'm searching for the right word.
Any of them will do.
Wisdom.
Wisdom.
Of the university administrators when there were some key decisions to be made at some pivotal points. And they failed. And I think that was partially our failure at the lab, that we didn't have them properly educated or briefed or sold or something.
Something like that. So I want to turn to a little bit more optimistic note. One of the things that's actually coming out, a lot of your comments, and when I was preparing for this panel, the one word that people seem to use over and over and over again was community. I couldn't believe how often I heard the community, and the community in sort of two places. One was the community in the lab, which we've discussed, and the other one was the broader sort of PLATO community. So I was wondering, and I think I'm going to start with Bob, because Bob has sort of like the broadest perspective here about how the community worked, and now with the advent of open source and everything like that, community is now viewed as a much more standard part of the innovation process. So Bob, maybe you could describe how the PLATO community worked and maybe what other innovators could learn from it, and then I think I'll ask David next to more.
You have to start with the fact that PLATO is from the very beginning, at its core, a community. And I don't just mean the people in the lab at CERL. I mean, the system itself was a way of creating community. And in the beginning, it was a pretty small community. It was 2 or 3 students who could communicate with one another. But just think about the basic characteristics of the system. You could not help but be a part of the community. If you used the system, if you worked on the system, if you used the system, either way, you became a part of the community. So it truly, the plasma is a great technology, but I think the true seminal technology of PLATO is the sense of community. Well, we heard from Ray Ozzie last night, for God's sake. I mean, just look at what was generated out of that one little kernel, a sense of community between 2 people, or 3 or 4, using a computer. It wasn't someone sitting at a console doing their own little thing. It was people interacting with one another. So I think the true technology of PLATO was the technology of community. And it could not, it was inevitable that it would give rise to open source. It was inevitable that it would give rise to communications kinds of improvements, because you couldn't really do the community without the communication improvements. And that was, if the cost of core memory was a big stumbling block, as we saw last night, $39 billion or something, the cost of communications is just absolutely incredible. So the pressure to do that, and the outgrowth of that, I think, is the most, maybe the most important contribution that Don and the people at the lab at CERL and all the people who contributed to PLATO, including my own company, over all the years, they built a sense of community. And to the degree that we have that today, we're better off than we would ever have been otherwise. And Lord knows we're bad enough off as it is.
So David, what's your take on this, since you were sort of more directly embedded?
Well, I guess, again, looking back on it, I see two elements, and I'm just a technology-focused person, so I always think about that. And as you said, obviously we had the community of people right there in the building that you saw all the time. But we had, again, uniquely at that time, and now ubiquitously today, we had this network, this communications network that was built from baling wire and tin cans and whatnot, that connected people throughout the campus, a set of people, and then connected people far more remotely. And we also had a set of storage facilities, again, novel at the time, but people not only did they not have to be in the same place, but they didn't have to be there at the same time, because you could write things and they would be read later. So this notes facility that we had that first started as just files where people would accumulate things, and then Dave Woolley, made that a more structured thing with threads and so forth, so that you could actually follow conversations, and the participants in that conversation didn't have to be there all simultaneously, and they didn't have to be in the same place. And so the participants in this, you got to know people that you had never met and that you had never seen and that you didn't know anything about other than through this window of the system and the network. And out of that came different kinds, different elements of community, different communities, different relationships, and so forth. And again, I didn't know any better as a youngster. This was just the way we worked. It was fascinating to me. As I said, I worked at CERL for a number of reasons. I went to control data, and people whose names I'd seen now were real people, and I sort of saw the other half of the community. But we'd been exchanging software. We'd ship code back and forth. People would make suggestions. We'd have virtual meetings in a rudimentary way. And I just saw that as extremely powerful. And now looking at it, and I think now we know as a society how readily we can. Some of it's good, some of it we think is bad economically, but we can shift jobs around and so on. But more importantly, we can pull innovation, we can pull creativity from anywhere.
From anywhere. So, Tina, what's your take on this community stuff?
I guess it's a contrarian view. For me, there was certainly a community, and the word comes up a lot. And for me, it really boiled down to individualism and the ability to be who you were or wanted to be. Because there was so much freedom and so much room to invent yourself and figure out who you were and present yourself in pretty much any way you wanted. And a lot of these people with whom we interacted, I met people yesterday whom I've known for decades and never had a face to go with them. I think what it provided was the freedom for people to invent themselves in a very fundamental way and figure out how you wanted to interact with people. So it wasn't the connections, and the connections were important, and the technology and the social media aspects of it, but for me it was never the community, it was how much everybody there got to be who they were.
So it's community but not conformity is sort of what you're saying, essentially.
And there wasn't much. Community to me, the unifying thread was the mission and why people were there. Except that everybody was there for a selfish reason too. For me, I learned that the luxury and the privilege of working on something I really believed in turned out to be something that motivated everything else I was willing to do for work for the rest of my life. It was transformative for me. And so there were selfish reasons, and what each one of us got out of it was this gift of being able to invent who you were and figure it out in this environment where there was unbelievable freedom. And so the community aspect of it was, it comes up all the time, and for me it just doesn't resonate as a unifying theme.
So Don, so now we got both opinions, so we'll leave them to you. So what's your sense on this? I don't know they're contradictory.
I think that the community idea was very important. Unfortunately, this is sort of one of the failures. It didn't include everybody in the community. And it's amazing how some people are so shut out in ideas that if they get into a position of power where they might be able to control some resources that you have, they can mess up a lot of things that are going very well. And I think this was part of the failure. I did try very hard to convince some of these people what was important. The same people, not very many of them turned out at the university, but a few, also tried to shut down the plasma panel. They didn't understand. They just said we got cathode ray tubes, plasma panels don't have a chance. That was the way they thought. We got standalone terminals. There's no reason to think about community. And no matter how hard I worked on them, and I worked very hard on them, I couldn't persuade them of that. And finally, Tina straightened me out. She said, Don, I kept thinking they had something else in the back of their mind. She said, don't apply motive when plain old stupidity will survive.
Never attribute to malice that which incompetence will explain.
If I could just comment, because again, sure. Don triggered a thought. This notion of occasionally having some poison in the community, if you will. I think that looking back at, you said, you know, maybe failure was allowing some of this to go on, where people were allowed to sort of poison things. And I certainly took away from my time there a great fear of that. And so, for example, one of my favorite stories, in fact, I was at a control data subsidiary, you know, 10 years after CERL and managing a group, and a fellow came to me and he said, "Oh, David, I'm just working so hard in this job for you." He worked for me, and you know, I'm getting called all the time at night to help people with their problems, and I need you to hire me more staff or do something to relieve this. And I said, well, my suggestion is that, tell me a little bit about what you're having to do in the middle of the night. And he said, oh, well, people call me all the time. They ask me to reset this or to do that. And I said, well, why don't you make a procedure out of that so that they can just do it themselves? Some set of keys they can press, since this seems to be a routine thing. Oh, well, gee, that would be difficult. I don't know if I could do that. I think I need to keep all that information to myself. And I said, okay, you're fired. And, you know, you can't fire me. I'm the only one that knows how to do this. That's exactly why I'm firing you. Because that's poisoning this organization. And again, you know, going back to my time at PLATO, where, you know, I never got anybody, when I went to them and said, can you explain this to me? Can you help me with this? Can you teach me something? Nobody ever said, no, I can't or I won't. They might have said, I can't because I don't know. They wouldn't say, I won't.
That's a great story. And I think that people rarely have the guts to do it. Okay, so I've got different clocks telling me different things, but I nonetheless think we've been ranting long enough. It's like time to pull you folks in. But before we do, and I want to keep this short, and Don, you don't get to talk, but we'll talk because we're going to talk about you. So one of the themes that comes through this over and over again, and you certainly can tell from the panel, and many of you out there know Don as well, is that there was clearly something, and is clearly something about Don's leadership style that inspired the people on the panel and many others to innovation and creativity. So maybe each of you could briefly, so a minute or less, let's say that, because I want to start pulling in folks, think about what do you think are the main hallmarks of Don's, if you will, leading of innovation, and what others could learn from it. And I think I'm going to start with you, Tina.
Don is so who he is.
You know,
it's not about show. It's about the fun and the problem and the mission. You know, this is a guy who all those years at the lab wore shoes that had holes in the soles that he used to fill the soles with, I don't know, what'd you use, cardboard?
I had it resold last week. So.
It was so about, you know, there are a lot of things that you go places and the problem or the issue or whatever's going on in the meeting, it isn't about what it's about, right? It's always about some other kind of thing. With Don, it's always about what it's about, and what it was about was the mission. And he was having fun, and he finds the good in everybody. You know, and I think that that's the issue, is that Don would look for, if he had to, the strength and help people blossom in their strength. And that's a really, it's inspiring one, and it's really addictive to have somebody who's really willing to believe in you and let you grow and help you grow, and actually not care about any of the sort of appearance issues. I mean, Don didn't care at all, and there are wonderful stories over the years about my husband worked at the lab and started there when he was a kid, and there was a period of his life when he had a lot of hair and a big beard, and Don told a story, which I'd never actually heard from him before, about people complaining, because this was like the late 60s and 70s, and you know, here's Don with his crew cut, and here's my husband who had all this hair and this beard, and
he was a hippie.
He was a hippie, and people kept saying, people had called his mother and said, this is very unbecoming, and this is, you know, can't you do something about it, and complained to Don about it. You want to tell the end of this story?
Well, let's make it very brief. I was not supposed to speak.
Go ahead. You're loud this time.
They came to me and said, you know, you got to make him cut that beard. I said, well, maybe and maybe not. They said, well, how will you decide? I said, well, it has to be a hazard. And we had that tape reader from control data. And they said, well, what do you do? I said, well, we're going to have him lean over and put the tape in. And if his beard gets down into the roller, we'll make him shorten it so it doesn't get in there. It turned out it didn't. It was pretty long, but it didn't get down there, so nothing was said. It went on.
Wow. That's the kind of thing lawyers like, actually. That's a pretty good test. David.
So you've heard, and Tina touched again on this, the problem solving and the devotion to the mission and having fun. And so those to me are really the top items. I think another thing that related, and again, Tina hinted at it, Don's always glass partially full, never focused on the empty. And I haven't managed to figure that out 100%. I still get frustrated by some things that aren't perfect or right, but he could always find the good. And one of my tasks was to travel occasionally around the community or around the state when we did these demonstrations. He did these demonstrations of the system for various groups, and I would go and act as a technician to support that. And I would watch these people come up and ask him questions, just inane questions. And I would after say, Don, why did you waste your time talking to that person? And they obviously didn't understand. I said, well, David, I don't really know who these people are or where they might go or who they might talk to, but they had a sincere interest, and so I just wanted to address that. Not judgmental, and I was so flabbergasted by that. And again, when it came back to solving problems, came back to the resources that we did or didn't have, it was always, let's just focus on where we are and what we can do.
Not judgmental, but with a real taste for quality and care in solving the problem.
Bob.
The old saying, optimist sees the glass as half full and pessimist half empty. Well, Don, it takes that to a whole different level.
It does.
You look at the glass and he says, hey, there's a drop of water in that glass.
This is cool.
This is really great. And you think to yourself, oh, God, he must be right. So I'll go look for a few more drops. And it's that kind of, so it is fun. And it is, of course, a mission. But what it really is the person who is way, way, way beyond themselves. Most of us spend a good bit of our lives worrying about ourselves. And Don worried about other people, answering their questions, helping them to succeed, helping them to solve problems. And so it's getting outside yourself, and that's Don Bitzer.
Which is a rare thing, actually, given,
yes, it is.
Given how our society breeds and rewards people. Okay, so as I say, in theory, we're supposed to end at 10 o'clock, but I'll sort of split the difference. So why don't we take about 8 or 9 minutes for questions and comments, because we've been rambling on here plenty long. I understand that there's folks with microphones there, and I know that many of you in the audience know an enormous amount about PLATO, and I'd be very curious to hear your comments and reactions and questions.
There's one here.
Thank you.
That's crazy.
My name's Jack Gotzman. I have a question for you, Don, and I'd like to have a follow-up question for Bob Price. Don, I've heard last night and today about the mission. What was success?
What was success of a mission?
Yeah.
Well, success was there's a technical success, namely that we were able actually to deliver education, and we were able to save a large number of students who would have not been in school if we hadn't done that. We developed a community which was not completely planned the way it was, but it worked out to be the way we wanted it. And we changed the way, we helped change the way the world was going to be in the future. And I think those are good measures of success.
Okay. Were there any, I guess I got 3 questions. Were there any metrics affiliated with that? Was there any metrics about, about those 3 objectives?
If you're thinking of success of, we could measure, like how well did we teach, how many passed, that kind.
How many simultaneous users?
No.
Well, we
That's a
had
process.
those technical measures. I wanted to run, I wanted to make it possible in the early days to run 4,000 simultaneous students off of one frame. And we did that. Then now they run 10 or 12,000 all the time. So that was a technical measure of success. We wanted to have so much memory for users. We wanted to develop so much courseware. Okay. But when it comes to educational success, we had measures. My wife was one of the first ones to do that. She was a subcontractor to me. I wouldn't do that again. But she...
You mean measure or have your wife do it?
She did a nursing lesson. I happened to bring the book with me. Not only had she completed the lessons and taught a set of students and gathered the data, but had written a report with the measurements of how the learning style interacted with how much they learned. That was 1963.
Great, thank you. Bob, what was the challenge of selling into the marketplace? Why weren't there more buyers? It's no reflection on your sales ability, by the way.
The eternal question. It reminds me of a story that one of my friends from Australia told me once, and he was just in an impossible situation where the customer or prospective customer obviously wasn't going to buy anything. The product didn't fit. It was no good, whatever. And he called up his boss and he says, "Listen, boss, I can't, I don't know what we're going to do. This guy is not going to buy." And the response of his boss was, "Sell a little harder." So, and I touched on that earlier, Jack, the aspect of creating demand for something is people simply don't realize how difficult that is. And there's some tried and true ways to do that. You could do reference cells. You can say, "Try it, you'll like it," and which was something Intel did in the very beginning, by the way. But a lot of it is just brute force work. So it takes a great deal of patience. And I think that the remarkable thing is that only now, 50 years later, was the concept that Don and his people had in terms of an automatic learning system is just the concepts that are there are just now being accepted in the marketplace. Sometimes it takes a generation change. Frequently it takes a generation change. Sometimes it takes 2 generation changes. And so patience and persistence are absolutely required.
All right. Other questions? There's a hand here. I don't know whether there's others.
I'm developing World University and School in a curious expression of synchronicity with your project some 50 years ago. It's like Wikipedia with MIT OpenCourseWare, UC Berkeley webcasts, and people-to-people teaching. And I'm curious how to build community based on your experience and how to begin to sort of spread the word, potentially all languages, 3,000 to 8,000 languages. And it's video and hop into a virtual world interactivity, degrees in some years. How would you sell it?
Another later.
I don't know if we know the answer to that, do we?
Sell harder.
My quick answer is look and see what Mozilla has done. Mozilla has done a brilliant job of having things translate in other language, but they don't do it with financial incentive. They do it with passion. So which is part of the story here too. It's passion and mission. But sometimes raw capitalists have trouble with that concept, even though it does work sometimes.
We have a question here.
I'm glad one of us can see Tina, because I'm like staring into the darkness here.
Well, I'll just speak loudly.
Oh, I like that.
Here's the
That's
microphone.
my style.
There you go.
I think one of the real issues was it was so far advanced. People couldn't see it. They couldn't wrap their heads around it. It was just too beyond anything that was familiar to them. And so that made the selling very hard indeed. They couldn't wrap their heads around it. And as Ruth said, it was hard for them to believe what you said about it because they had no experience of it. Stan Smith, the chemist, once said, you want to lead the parade, but you don't want to be so far ahead that they can't see you. And that was part of our problem.
Well, Don, you have any comment on that? Because that's a very interesting comment.
Well, it's Bruce is correct in that it was far advanced, and if you actually took the time to see it, you flipped immediately. But if you didn't know what it was about but wanted to talk about it, particularly if it was competitive, if you were going for the same fund somewhere, then you just wrote what you thought it was, not what it is. And that made a difference.
I think another important factor, when I think now what we have today, what we use today versus back then, the entry hurdle to this system economically was very high. If you were a school making a commitment, even if you were just committing to a few terminals, but if you were committing to a mainframe computer and this infrastructure and so on, this is a multi-million-dollar endeavor. And you can always, especially in these sorts of institutions, teaching institutions, which are very sort of consensus-oriented, there's always somebody that's going to say no. There's always somebody that's going to put up a stink and so forth. If you look now, we have all these tools that we're adopting, be they iPhones or services on the web, they're either cheap if you have to buy them. You can make that decision individually and throw your credit card down for it and try it out. Services on the web are free initially. So the ability to get a little core nucleus and build momentum and prove the tool in your own environment.
So the foot in the door was a big foot.
It was a big,
and
big foot.
There's
really.
an issue when you talk about these consensus-driven environments with people's intrinsic versus extrinsic validators. So there weren't enough extrinsic validators saying, oh, this is really the greatest thing since sliced bread. It was people's intrinsic sense of, look at this is cool, this can give us possibilities, but it's hard to go and sell, I believe this is really cool and it's going to do stuff, as opposed to being able to say, look at all this whole sheet of important people who say this is, it's an interesting dynamic in this particular marketplace.
Maybe we could have, why don't we make this the last question, because I'm a little worried about messing up the schedule for the day, even though they're giving us a little more time. So why don't we make this the last question?
Okay.
Or comment.
I was actually a high school student also from Uni High, so I want to comment a little bit more about what David was saying in the terrific environment. It was just so much fun. It was terrific fun, and you never thought of it as any kind of work. It was just next project. And it was something, I was a 15-year-old when I started. It's something that really affected a lot of other people. You were building things and other people were using them. And not only that, you learned, and I was speaking with Don about this yesterday, real responsibility, because you could crash the system. And so there was this attitude, you broke it, you fix it, which you really don't hear so much today, like this whole BP disaster. It's this attitude where, and you have a backup plan, Then Don was mentioning that too. We learned this as kids, but we were treated like anybody else, like adults, and we were mentored by people with, professors at the university. And staff all around. And it was just an enormously wonderful environment for me. And there was this attitude of, when I later went into industry, they said, well, I do this sort of thing. I don't do that sort of thing. I do compilers, I do software, I do this, I do that. And there it was, I can do hardware, I can do software, whatever project it was, I do a compiler thing or this thing. There was none of these differences, right, Don? It was just, we just do it and we'll figure it out. And that's sort of what David was saying. I just want to enhance upon that, how wonderful environment it was. And you can still do it today, but you need people like Don and a setup to do it. That's all. And kids need this. Kids need this.
It's funny how often these two themes that you gave people permission and gave them protection. I hear that sort of over and over again. So I think we should probably wrap, but Don, do you have any final words since...
Well, my only final words were, as you can see, that any success I've had is based upon all these wonderful young people who worked for me, who crawled through the windows, and I would grab them before the police caught them, take them to a room where they could work, and did all the various other ideas and things. And I still do that today, and there are still young people out there today who know how to become creative even though they're young. And our school systems do need an outlet for these students in order to have them develop. And it's one way of helping our school systems, is making it possible for these brilliant, young, aggressive, bright, careful students to go into places where they can do things that are useful.
Let's say thank you to Don.
I think that's a pretty good ending. So
I do too.
Round
Thanks.
of applause.
Thanks very much.